After Rome and Jerusalem, it's one of the most popular destinations for pilgrimages in the world, and one of the most mysterious places in Christianity. It is in this Pyrenean grotto that the Virgin is said to have appeared in person to the young peasant Bernadette Soubirous in the middle of the 19th century.
She does not call it by a name. She's afraid to name it, which suggests that she perhaps thinks it might be a fairy.
A grotto in which miracles have been said to have taken place.
She felt compelled to go to the grotto, and the moment she puts her hand into the water, it fully regains its agility.
Lourdes is such a holy place that it has become one of the major sanctuaries in Europe, attracting millions of pilgrims from all over the world.
Pilgrimages to Lourdes will develop globally with the appearance of railways, and this will radically change the history of pilgrimages in the West.
How did this unusual 128-acre architectural construction with 3 eclectic basilicas spring from the ground to produce the biggest underground crypt in the world?
St. Peter's in Rome could fit inside the Basilica of St. Pius X, even though St. Peter's is the largest basilica in Rome.
What technical challenges did the designers have to overcome for more than a century of work? How did they break down these mountains? Here is the incredible story of the construction of the Lourdes sanctuaries. In the Pyrenees Mountains, a few miles from the French-Spanish border, thousands of worshippers take part in a procession in honor of the Virgin Mary. At the heart of this incredible megastructure to God, the sanctuaries of Lourdes. An immense 128-acre space, which counts no less than 3 basilicas. Perched on the Rock of Massabielle, the Immaculate Conception, built in the Gothic style, peaks at 328 feet above the river. Lower down, hollowed out of the same rock, the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary, built in the Roman Byzantine style, can welcome up to 4,000 worshippers. Its parvis, inspired by St. Peter's in Rome, can welcome 40,000 more. To the east, buried 32 feet below the surface, the Basilica of St. Pius X has the capacity for 20,000 pilgrims. With a length of 655 feet and a width of 265 feet, it's the biggest crypt ever built in the world. A sanctuary entirely built around a grotto. A sacred place where the Virgin Mary is said to have appeared 150 years earlier.
The grotto is really the heart of the sanctuary. The pilgrims themselves bear witness to the fact that there's a kind of allure to the grotto.
And for good reason, as it's here that the Mother of God is said to have revealed the existence of a spring with extraordinary properties. Water which would be the origin of 70 unexplained healings.
It's true that the water attracts a lot of sick pilgrims hoping for a cure. Therefore, at Lourdes, you come to the source, you come to the grotto, you come to drink this water, quite simply because it's the Virgin Mary who gave us this water. Therefore, it feeds hope into the hearts of pilgrims in a very, very big way.
Catholics believe so strongly in Lourdes that it attracts millions of sick and dying pilgrims each year. Lourdes, a unique place, therefore, whose story begins in the biting cold winter of 1858. That morning, a young shepherdess, barely 14 years of age, Bernadette Soubirous, is collecting firewood on the edge of the river Gave.
She hears a loud gust of wind. She turns around and notices that the poplar trees are not moving. And at that moment, the wind no longer comes from behind her, but in front of her. And then she looks into the Massabielle grotto.
The grotto is also known as a place of supernatural happenings, a place where fairies emerge because they're again on this place between civilization and wildness.
And there she sees light and a woman whom she calls a beautiful woman.
And she says she does not call it by a name, which suggests that she perhaps thinks it might be a fairy because fairies punish people when you name them. At this moment, she doesn't seem to claim at all that it is the Virgin.
This is a region where religion and legends of goblins and giants are all mixed together. The apparition, with the appearance of a fairy that Bernadette will from now on name Aquero, which means that in patois, asks her to come back to the grotto every day for the next 2 weeks. On the 13th apparition, she assigns Bernadette a task: to deliver a mysterious message to Abbot Peyramal, the village priest.
And Bernadette is small, young, and frail, and he is a colossus of a man in the prime of his life.
And Bernadette, with unbelievable self-assurance, gives Father Peyramal this message: tell the priests to build a chapel here, and tell people to come in procession.
So a chapel will have to be built near the Massabielle grotto. But the rock which overhangs the grotto is 89 feet tall, and the surface is irregular. The only access is via a narrow track nicknamed Breakneck Path. The crevices in the rock weaken it and lower it down. Plus, the River Gave makes the ground spongy and prone to flooding. The request of the apparition seems impossible to meet.
So, to start with, you want me to organize a procession and build a chapel for a lady who hasn't even said her name? Plus, at the time, it's the regime of the Second Empire, so this needs authorization from the state. The state will never give authorization for that.
If the Abbot Peyramal is skeptical, this is not the case of the villagers, who seem literally bewitched by the young shepherdess. From now on, they will be in their hundreds, and then thousands, accompanying her to each of the apparitions.
And they are impressed. She's transfigured from sort of flea-ridden girl in rags of wool into something people perceive as very beautiful. There is something about the solemnity of her embodiment that really does make people watch her with respect.
During the recitation of the Rosary, Bernadette says, "The lady is here, the lady is here." And at the same time, Bernadette goes into a profound ecstasy. Then asks the lady her name 4 times. And on the 4th time, the lady says, "I am the Immaculate Conception."
On the way home, Bernadette, scared of forgetting, repeats to herself this strange string of words that she doesn't know. Que soy era Immaculada Concepción. Abbot Peyramal is stunned. How can a young shepherdess who doesn't know how to read or write, how can she know these terms which are only known to theologians?
And Father Peyramal doesn't give any explanations to Bernadette. He starts crying because he understands that Bernadette has seen a lady, a beautiful lady, and that lady is the Virgin Mary.
From then on, convinced of the truth of the apparitions, he informs the Bishop of Tarbes, Monseigneur Bertrand Sévère Laurence.
And he says there's something going on in our community. There's an élan mystique, there's a renewal of faith. And not only a renewal of faith, but a kind of ethical consciousness that is emerging, that people are becoming, in a sense, holier because of the events. There is no doubt that Laurence, who comes out of the attempts by the church in this period to reconstitute itself in the aftermath of the revolution sees this as a chance for reconversion.
And what better way to evangelize a country than with a new place for pilgrimages? A chapel which had been requested by the Mother of God herself. The bishop believes that the future edifice should be dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, whose worship was proclaimed 4 years earlier in 1854 by Pope Pius IX.
That it becomes dogma is very important because it is the ultimate miracle of faith. Mary is not just giving birth as a virgin, she is also conceived herself without sin. And Pius is concerned to multiply these miracles of faith in contrast to what he sees as the errors, which are rationalism, liberalism, scientism.
But the bishop is careful because the infatuation with Bernadette could dwindle at any moment. Recognizing the apparitions too early could put him in an awkward position vis-à-vis the church. It's therefore with great discretion that he meets an architect known for his devotion and his great piety.
Hippolyte Durand is the architect who is approached. He is a diocesan architect. Hippolyte Durand was involved in a new movement which veered towards recapturing the Middle Ages by searching for examples in the great cathedrals, and who would like to restore Christian faith through architecture.
The man who was the architect of the Château de Monte Cristo, built for Alexandre Dumas, gains the trust of the bishop. He immediately gets to work. Durand opts for a Roman Byzantine style. As is the tradition, he positions the future chapel towards the rising sun, symbolic of Christ illuminating the world at the first light of dawn. Access will be to the west, following breakneck path. But just at the time when he was about to present his plans, the bishop makes a surprising request.
We must think of a way to organize the pilgrimage and the way in which the pilgrims live. So that the pilgrims can enjoy a place of rest, we will ask the architect to change the direction of the church. Instead of positioning it to the east, the choir will be to the west, the side where it rains. And the eastern part will be the entrance to the chapel. Actually, in this porch, the pilgrims could find shelter and sleep.
In this way, the pilgrims will be protected from the rain and from the prevailing winds. But the chapel will lose one of the strongest symbols of Christian worship.
The positioning of the church must have been quite revolutionary. But what exactly won the deal was that to compensate for the space, to adjust to the level of the hillock, the architect suggested adding a crypt. And this crypt was exactly above the mandala, where the Blessed Virgin appeared. So, as a result, it was possible for the crypt to be at the symbolic heart of Lourdes.
On the 18th of January, 1862, the bishop signed an official declaration recognizing the reality of the apparitions.
To comply with the wishes of the Blessed Virgin, we suggest building a sanctuary on the grounds of the grotto.
Works will be fully funded by donations from worshippers. All that's left to be done is for the bishop to organize the pilgrimage to make Lourdes the jewel of the Catholic reconquest of France. On the 13th of October, 1862, early in the morning, a huge explosion resonates on the Espelugas mountain. The demolition work for the building of the Immaculate Conception has just started. Abbot Peyramal is enthusiastic.
It's a pleasure to see the rock smashed to smithereens in the exploding mines. On the other side of the Pyrenees, where the echoes must carry these detonations, they must think there are terrible battles going on.
There was a rocky outcrop in the middle of the ground, and so before starting work, they had to blow this up to try and level the ground a bit. It was a huge task, especially as they had to make sure when working above the grotto not to disrupt the ground too much, which could weaken it. It's really an important element in the construction of the sanctuaries. So for all the work that was done, major precautions were taken.
At the same time, the architect Hippolyte Durand is putting the finishing touches to his new project. The chapel will be neo-Gothic in style. It will be 167 feet in length, 69 feet wide, and 62 feet high. The spire will be 305 feet high above the Gave. To bear the weight of such a mass of stone, powerful 7 feet thick and 65 feet tall walls will be supported by 7 powerful buttresses and connected to the rock by chains fixed to it. The grotto will be left in its original state.
The idea to keep the grotto as untouched as possible is still an idea that appeals to everyone. We wanted it as close as possible to how Bernadette experienced it. We placed the statue of the Virgin exactly where Bernadette saw her, to give a visual idea of how the grotto was at the time, and to keep this image as a strong image of Lourdes.
In the month of August 1863, the work on the support walls is finished. It cost 300,000 francs, a fortune at the time. It's necessary to quickly launch another appeal for donations. And for that, the bishop can count on the notoriety of the pilgrimage, and especially on the spring revealed by Bernadette 5 years earlier during the 9th apparition.
Bernadette is on her knees. She's doing penance. And then the lady says, "Drink from the fountain and wash yourself." And she shows her a place under the rock. And she scratches at the ground with her hands, and it feels moist.
A spring coming from nowhere, emanating from the depths of the earth. For the hundreds of witnesses present that day, there was no doubt. This water can only be a divine gift.
So from the moment when she discovered the source, people will start to return in the afternoon to widen it, etc. The water began to flow, so I find that quite a beautiful symbol. The more we drank, the more there was. It was not going to run out.
Water which is soon going to drastically change the fate of Lourdes when a woman who'd been paralyzed in her right hand for many months visits the grotto in Massabielle.
Catherine Latapie, who lives 7 miles from Lourdes in a village called Loubajag, feels compelled to go to the grotto. The moment she puts her hand into the water, it fully regains its agility.
Miracle or not, in the months which follow, there will be dozens who attest to having benefited from inexplicable healing. Is the water from Lourdes miraculous? The mayor of the village would like to be sure.
The mayor is deeply moved and understands very quickly that maybe Bernadette has just discovered a thermal spring. And it's for that reason that the town hall gets the water analyzed. At first, by a pharmacist who also understands what's at stake and whose analysis may be a bit biased, and he suggests that it is, in fact, thermal water. But a second analysis confirms the reality, that the Massabielle water is normal for that part of the Pyrenees.
If the mayor sees his dream of a thermal spa fade away, the bishop sees the potential in this water, which in principle has no recognized properties, but which, however, could be capable of curing the incurable. From that moment on, Lourdes becomes the last chance pilgrimage for thousands of sick people. A pilgrimage which, in 1867, will be able to rely on the arrival of the first railway line in the valley.
In this year, a Basque abbot, Abbot La Parade from Bayonne, had an idea, which will in fact turn out to be a great idea, to organize a special train for the pilgrims. So the railways will organize the transport for the sick. From then on, the pilgrimage to Lourdes will develop on a European level, then global, with the advent of the railways.
A massive influx of pilgrims means financial mana, which is going to play into the hands of the bishop. Because the works for the chapel are more expensive than initially thought, the bishop will resort to a new technique in vogue at the time, photography. Prints of Bernadette that the pilgrims will literally fall over themselves to buy.
These photographs were staged, which show at moments her grief and annoyance at being pushed to reproduce for the camera a certain vision of her spirituality and her trances.
It's a means of propaganda, yes, that's clear. Bernadette will say, I'm being sold for so much? Oh, if that's what I'm worth, well.
An icon who is selling well, but who is soon going to be in the way. During the inauguration of the crypt, the young woman is a guest of the festivities, but the bishop wants, at all costs, to avoid her being the star. So the young woman attends the ceremony dressed as a child of Mary and firmly escorted by nuns.
The danger was, of course, that it wouldn't be the veneration of the Virgin, but it might become the veneration of Bernadette. That was what the church worried about.
2 months later, on the 4th of July, 1866, Bernadette leaves Lourdes for the Saint Gildard de Nevers convent in Brittany, where she will take the veil. She will never come back to see her mountains nor the Grotto of Massabielle until her death. On the site, the works advance at the rhythm that the funds are collected and is dependent on the capricious weather. Luckily, Hippolyte Durand can rely on one advantage which will gain him several precious months: the many quarries present around the village.
Lourdes is a town of stonecutters, and at the moment of the apparitions, there are roughly 200 families who make a living from working with stone. Lourdes is stone, marble, and slate. It is these same workers, these same stonecutters, who will be hired to build the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception.
The stones are carried by carts and come from the town where the pilgrims who want to go to the grotto are already numerous. They use the same path. So with all these people in the same place, they have to make sure there are no accidents, no carts overturning on the pilgrims.
A narrow space which forces Hippolyte Durand to make certain concessions regarding the plan of the chapel.
He couldn't really adapt the Gothic architectural plan to the location. He had to adapt to the land. So for that reason, he couldn't build a transept, nor could he make large flying buttresses to strengthen these archways.
These buttresses are usually present in Gothic churches and counterbalance the weight that the archways exert on the walls. An omission which, in the long run, could have proved catastrophic for the solidity of the building. But the architect is going to have an ingenious idea.
He installed lateral chapels along the nave, which are linked with each other, and which also allowed for the creation of a sort of ambulatory. From these chapels, we can see that the walls are relatively large because it's these which play the role of buttresses.
Thanks to his ingenuity, Hippolyte Durand achieved the feat of building a church that can accommodate 1,000 worshippers on a steep, narrow, rocky outcrop. On the 15th of August, 1871, the Chapel of the Immaculate Conception is inaugurated, a ceremony during which one man is noticeable by his absence, Monseigneur Lawrence, who died several months earlier during a trip to Rome. He leaves behind him the first piece of a vast enterprise destined to become one of the biggest sanctuaries in the world. But before becoming an important place of national pilgrimage, Lourdes still has to pass one final test, obtaining recognition from its peers. One year earlier, in 1870, chaos takes over the country as Prussia inflicts a stinging defeat on the French army, causing the fall of Napoleon III and the Second Empire. France is humiliated. For the majority of French Catholics and those close to the monarchists, it's no coincidence.
Many Catholics believed this notion that France was the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church, and that once it deviated from that mission, then this was when things started to go wrong. They had to engage in acts of repentance and move back to a vision of France that they thought had been lost, certainly since the Revolution of 1789.
At Lourdes, a priest, Abbé Chocarne, is going to have a revelation. A plan which could have been whispered to him by God himself to redeem the sins of France.
He is celebrating Mass in the Chapel of the Immaculate Conception, and there, during Mass, he is distracted. He understood that the Virgin summons the sick to Lourdes, but who is sick? France is sick. How else to interest the Virgin in the fate of France, if not by doing what she asks for? And what does she ask for? For processions, joining together at Lourdes, all the Marian sanctuaries in France.
Through the sanctuaries dedicated to the Virgin Mary, it's the entire nation who will do penance. A pilgrimage which they hope will have at least 10,000 participants. In the village, the 4,000 inhabitants get involved in offering lodgings and shelter. Above all, the sanctuary, from now on, can count on a true army of pious and devout women to welcome the sick.
There is no way that we can understand the Lourdes phenomenon without coming to grips with the role of women in promoting these kinds of devotions. So what you get is an increasingly woman's institution, still run by men and still within a very patriarchal mold, because the men, of course, are still running the show.
On the 5th of October, 1872, a human tide descends on the Pyrenean city. In 3 days, 120,000 hosts are consecrated. Representatives of 300 sanctuaries march with 320 banners.
There is an enormous amount of people. We will count 70,000 people on the day of the march.
Lourdes, for most of the period that it's in operation, can mobilize larger crowds than any labor movement on the left.
So we exceeded everything we thought possible.
Since then, the pilgrimage has become national. Delegations from all the French dioceses will come to Lourdes each year. So the entire country will be devoted to the Virgin Mary. Strengthened by its success, the Basilica receives grace from Pope Pius IX, who raises the status of the Chapel of the Immaculate Conception to the rank of minor basilica. From now on, nothing can stop the incredible ascension of this Pyrenean city.
The town will be transformed by the Lourdes pilgrimage, as Lourdes will devote itself to welcoming pilgrims. So how does this work at the beginning? The people of Lourdes see all these people arriving, so they begin opening boarding houses, and then the first hotels arrive, so that soon all the left bank of the Gave will become a hotel zone.
A dazzling success which the new Bishop of Tarbes, Monseigneur Benoît-Marie Langenieur, must cope with. Because barely finished, the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception is no longer sufficient to absorb the uninterrupted flow of pilgrims.
Monseigneur Langenieur, in front of all these pilgrims, thinks, if we're going to leave them outside to celebrate Mass, we're going to need altars, etc. There are an enormous amount of things, and he thinks a new church is needed.
In 1883, approaching the 25th anniversary of the apparitions, pilgrims come in mass. For the new church, a new architect is approached, Leopold Hardy, the chief architect of the two international expositions in Paris.
The idea behind his project was obviously not to go down the Gothic route, since the Gothic style with its big Ogleval archways would create a problem of height, with a part of the Immaculate Conception being hidden. So it was necessary to construct a building less elevated.
For this, Hardy pictured a church in the style of Roman Byzantine, because this type of building, in the form of a Greek cross, has the advantage of having a dome. Seated on four enormous pillars, it will give enough space to welcome 4,000 pilgrims, but above all, it will allow him to limit its height to 43 feet.
Here, the architect has been extremely intelligent and respectful, because he has slid his building under the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, that we often call the Superior Basilica. So you have the impression that it's only one building, or if you approach it, you have the feeling that the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary serves as a pedestal, as support for the Basilica above.
On each side, gigantic arcades will support ramps that will rise to the Superior Basilica. With a gentle slope of 4 inches per yard, they will facilitate the pilgrimage. They encircle a vast parvis of 427 by 279 feet, in which 40,000 people can assemble, enough for the sanctuaries to realize their ambitions for decades. On the 16th of July, 1883, the construction of the Rosary Church starts, 25 years to the day after the last apparition. But the first trenches are barely dug when Leopold Hardy is urgently called to the building site.
There was a canal, the Merlas Canal, which passed just below. And there was also the water from the Gave, so the ground was quite porous at that place, and quite humid,
resulting in the entire foundations being submerged underwater.
So they had to drain it to extract all the water that was there in order to construct a relatively sound edifice.
And that's not the end of Hardy's problems. To clear the space necessary for this future edifice, 353,000 cubic feet of rock was taken from the mountain with large explosive reinforcements. The new basilica will literally be built into the rock. But water flowing from the top of the mountain to the valley could endanger the walls of the basilica in the long term. The architect will have a clever idea. Isolate the building from the rock with the help of a separation gallery.
So we arrive here in a very private part of the Rosary Church, as here is the interface between the wall of the Rosary Chapel, the Basilica, and here the support wall holding the rock. Therefore, at the moment of the building, it was decided to separate these two walls and thus make a kind of protection.
To consolidate his masonry, Hardy will place landfill arches all along the corridor.
Lourdes is a place where there is a lot of earthquakes, so you also have to balance the Mass so that it can last for years to come.
To avoid pockets of water accumulating behind the support wall, the architect has holes made in the rock wall through which water can flow into the gutter.
We have the impression that we're in a grotto, and we find here the formation of stalactites, stalagmites, limestone which stays on the surface, and the water runs along it. And therefore in Lourdes, we can see water in all its forms. We have the miraculous water which comes from the grotto and which heals, and then we have the water from the rock which runs here, but which could also have been a disruptive element for the architecture.
"6 years is enough time to finish the structural work. Now, all that is left is the interior design. The church will be devoted to the Rosary, a prayer ritual dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It will comprise 15 chapels, each one decorated with one of the 15 mysteries of faith. A life-size summary of the Gospel.
We wanted this basilica to illustrate the Rosary prayer, as if the basilica itself was, in a way, a huge rosary. The Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary is a type of instruction for the pilgrims. And so, through the images, it's always the will of the Church to be able to, and today it's very fashionable, to be able to evangelize.
A handy tool for converting souls. It remains to find a material capable of resisting the extreme climatic conditions of the valley. By chance, a technique as old as Herod has just been brought up to date: mosaic.
The advantage of mosaic compared to paint is that it's more durable, and once it's placed, as long as there's no disturbance in the stability of the wall, it will never move. If you think of the mosaics in Rome or Pompeii, they're still there and in perfect condition.
The execution of this decoration will be supervised by Domenico Facchina, the most famous mosaicist in France, because this man has developed a revolutionary laying technique. Instead of posing the tesseras one by one on the wall, as you do traditionally, the designs are put together on a base in the workshop. These are then stuck on the wall in reverse. The execution time is thus considerably reduced. In this way, the 15 chapels will be covered in 16,000 square feet of mosaics for a total cost of 450,000 francs, which is the equivalent of 1.8 million euros, an incredible fortune.
If France gave, I was going to say, the majority of the money for the construction of the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, it's now the whole world which will participate in the construction of the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary.
In less than 3 decades, the Lourdes sanctuaries have become very profitable. The walls of the chapels are covered, bit by bit, in thousands of marble plaques, testimony to the extraordinary healing and donations in hard currency. But in September 1891, while the building site of the Rosary was far from being finished and still needing financing, a man arriving by train from Paris will single-handedly cause trouble and stir up the church as far as the Holy See. At the beginning of autumn, Émile Zola, the famous author of Germinal and the Beast Within, discovers the city of Lourdes for the first time, attracted by the innumerable miracles supposedly taking place there. A distinguished guest for whom the sanctuaries roll out the red carpet.
Zola comes with the national pilgrimage and will want to see the sick and to witness medical consultations. He sees the returning Clémentine Trouvé, who was cured in the national pilgrimage of 1891.
They have a belief that they will convert him.
Zola does not believe in the apparitions for 1 second, nor the cures. In August 1894, the writer publishes Lourdes, an incendiary novel accusing the Church of making substantial profits at the expense of the sick. In barely 2 months, the book becomes a bestseller.
The writing of his book dedicated to Lourdes will be poorly received by the Catholics, who will feel humiliated. He says that Bernadette had experienced hallucinations.
His book is a combat weapon. He's basically saying, they are liars, they are hypocrites, they are thieves.
The matter reaches the Holy See, who is worried. The book is forbidden by the Congregation of the Index, who pose a ban absolutely prohibiting Christians to read it.
They are afraid that there's a persuasive power in Zola's prose that might actually probably affect Catholics and undermine their faith. After that you see the multiplication of caricatures in the Catholic press of Zola as a kind of demonic person.
Finally, the counter-propaganda works. Donations continue to roll in. Zola will not bring down the work on the Rosary. Ironically, the sanctuaries will even find a way of using the novelist to give the chapel its final touch.
To do penance, to ask forgiveness for what Zola has written, the Bishop of Lourdes will ask the population to donate money for the organs for the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary in compensation.
Thereby finishing the works on both the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception and the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary. But in Lourdes, where the ambitions are always getting bigger and bigger, a new bishop will again put on workman's overalls and bring the sanctuaries into the modernity and gigantism of the new century. In 1953, the new Bishop of Tarbes, Monseigneur Théas, faces a daunting challenge: the organization of the centennial of the apparitions, an event which will be attended by 5 million pilgrims. But for almost 50 years, nothing more has been built in the sanctuaries.
He understands that the reception capacities are too small. Hence his idea of building a huge place of worship.
A place where we can have processions on the days when it rains. And it rains a lot in Lourdes.
And so the idea was to build a basilica which could accommodate 20,000 people.
But an edifice capable of offering such a capacity would be impossible to build to classical architectural standards for a reasonable sum. The solution will come from Rome, where Pope Pius XII has recently undertaken a profound liturgical reform.
It just so happens that Pius XII had just published an apostolic letter called Mediator Dei, where he mentions contemporary art. And Pius XII feels the need for churches to also live by this art.
The future church will, therefore, be resolutely modern and made from concrete. A revolutionary choice at the time, but one which has the advantage of being more economical than stone. An architect is approached, Pierre Vago, because this man, a big fan of Le Corbusier, is the founder of a prestigious journal on contemporary architecture.
He will explain to Monseigneur Théas that if he envisages a superstructure with 20,000 seats, it will completely obscure the chapel of the Immaculate Conception. We would have had a type of colossal hangar, enormous, which would have completely dwarfed the entire site of the grotto. So it would be better to put the church underground.
The future edifice will be buried under the vast meadow which borders the Gave. It will be constrained to the south by the road, which runs along the sanctuaries, and to the north by the path which links the crowned Virgin with St. Michael's Gate. Made in an elliptical shape reminiscent of a fish, symbolizing the first Christians, it will measure 656 feet long and 262 feet wide.
There's not really a plan. It's a mandala, which is in the style of the hole in which the Blessed Virgin appears in the grotto. And so the building corresponded exactly to the intentions at the start of the project, to create a structure in the image of Bernadette, modest, simple.
It's an extremely bold choice. In 1959, it's clear that there are few people who like this style.
It is imperative that the building is finished in less than 5 years, in time for the centennial of the apparitions. The cost is estimated at 2 billion francs, which is the equivalent of 36 million euros, and once again, the faithful will be asked to contribute. In December 1955, after the bishop has validated the plans, a problem needs to be solved: the roof of the future edifice. The engineers suggest a vast crypt supported by pillars, an idea which is not approved by Pierre Vago, who wants the building as stripped back as possible. So he contacts Eugène Freycinet, inventor of a new revolutionary method of construction, pre-stressed concrete. A technique which permits the building of long concrete archways without intermediate support.
Freycinet created an immense hall without any pillars inside this huge volume. Everything is completely liberated by the fact that we have these big pre-stressed concrete structures which can completely absorb the space.
2 series of 58 semi-arches resting on a long central beam will support the roof. First, the concrete is poured into a formwork. Then, steel cables are slid in a sheath placed in the lower part of the beam. Hydraulic jacks then tension the cables to prevent the beam from collapsing. Compressed, the concrete thereby becomes pre-stressed. Thus, the edifice will have a surface nearly as big as St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, 156,000 square feet, and without any central pillars.
It's said that St. Peter of Rome could be contained inside the Basilica of St. Pius X, even though St. Peter's is the largest basilica in Rome.
The official start of construction is given as the 30th of May 1956. But when the excavation has just passed 7 feet deep, water will once again appear, transforming the giant hole into a real-size lake.
All the priests who were coming noted this space filled with water. And this water worried them. They said, what does it mean? We won't be able to build on it, etc.
At the same time, Monseigneur Théas received the first invoices, which add up to 300 million francs. But the funding only managed to raise a few dozen. A wind of panic blows on the French episcopate and becomes a national affair.
The bills were arriving for Monseigneur Théas, who needed to pay them. And he had no money to pay the companies who were doing the work. And the best had been chosen. So there came a time when effectively the bishop said, well, we have to stop everything.
They raised the question of filling that hole back in. They were going to fill it in.
An order validated by the Holy See itself. Desperate, the bishop turned to the Virgin. However, the miracle is going to come from his construction manager.
It's Campenon Bernard who tells him, you must obey. So you have to stop the works, but I'm continuing. I'm going to pay the workers, who are destined to continue the work, from my own pocket, so that it will be finished on the date and time we had decided on for the centennial of the apparitions. And if Campion Bernard hadn't done that, I don't think we would ever have had the Basilica of St. Pius X.
The architects brought in by Vago find a clever technical solution to overcome the water infiltration. A metal curtain comprising steel blades 12 inches in width and 59 feet long will be placed along the 1,600 feet circumference of the building. These blades will be driven into the ground to a depth of 59 feet, thus creating a barrier stemming the flow of water around the future edifice. Finally, to avoid any infiltration, a system of channels under the gigantic concrete slab will drain the water thanks to a pump up to 26 feet deep and eject it back into the Gave.
This system has been in place since the opening of the Basilica, and there have never been any problems. The system has been so well planned, thought out. We have a principle of tubing, which allows for the complete drainage of this building, which floats a bit on the water, but everything is drained.
On the 18th of July, 1957, the work can finally restart. First, the water is pumped to dry the foundations. The arches are then poured into gigantic formworks. And then an incredible concrete structure arises from the ground. In less than 6 months, the skeleton of the future basilica is in place. The 129,000 square feet of the roofing is covered in pre-stressed concrete slabs and 4,000 tons of earth. Inside, the decoration is minimalist.
Vago chose an architecture which completely manifests contemporary art. The Basilica of St. Pius X is extremely bare, very stripped back, without decoration. He didn't want statues, leaving the supports, the crutches of the archways, and the resolutely modern architecture on show.
The choir, traditionally situated at the back of the church, is placed in the center of the building. A revolution at the time where the liturgy imposes the priests to do Mass with their backs to the faithful.
The idea of placing the altar in the center was indeed something new, original. If you put the altar at the end of a vast ellipse, the people, the furthest back, are 650 feet away. At the time it was constructed, there weren't any televisions inside.
On the 24th of March, 1958, the basilica is consecrated in front of thousands of believers. It's the Archbishop of Venice, Angelo Roncalli, who will become Pope John XXIII several months later, who is in charge of the blessing.
All the dioceses in France and Europe assemble, and the influx is a constant coming and going. All the people of Lourdes will tell you that they've never seen so many people at Lourdes, and this will stay forever in their memory.
Thereby finishing the construction of the sanctuaries of Lourdes, a huge place of worship and pilgrimages which continues to attract millions of pilgrims from 5 continents 160 years after its creation. Each attracted by an indelible faith in the miracles and the singular story of a young shepherdess who has since become one of the most worshipped saints in the world. Without its sublime monuments, colossal boulevards, and magnificent buildings, Paris would not be the city of light. Without its unique urban fabric, Paris would not be the most visited city in the world. It owes its development to 2 men, Emperor Napoleon III and his right-hand man, Prefect Haussmann.
Haussmann was seen as a destroyer. I mean, the nickname was the Alsatian Attila. You know, he came through like a Hun, really, you know, to build this new functional city.
The Baron changed the face of the French capital in a series of gargantuan construction projects undertaken between 1853 and 1870, implementing a methodical plan to decompartmentalize the city. 63 kilometers of new roads and 40,000 buildings were created.
To pull down thousands of buildings, build new ones, build new arteries is an absolutely fascinating undertaking that I don't know of any other parallel for.
Haussmann's Paris also unveiled many prestigious new monuments watching over the new thoroughfares.
It indicates not only direction, but also the extent of the incursion. It adds a kind of majesty, highlighting the notion of length.
Almost 2,000 hectares of parkland were introduced, along with 600 kilometers of aqueducts and 380 kilometers of sewers to improve the capital's deplorable sanitation.
It was a seething mass of humanity undertaking an immense task.
But redevelopment came at a price. The lower classes were often forced into exile, and laborers met their deaths in the drive to give Paris a facelift.
There were thousands of men at work with some very serious falls and injuries.
This is the extraordinary and controversial tale of the epic works undertaken by Baron Haussmann, the story of the 19th century's largest construction site. An aerial view of Paris. The broad avenues, the elegant buildings. To create this grandiose spectacle, Haussmann demolished more than 20,000 houses. And he doubled the average width of the city's roads from 12 to 24 meters. It is hard to imagine that 170 years ago, before Haussmann and Napoleon III, the City of Light was a maze-like cesspool. In the mid-19th century, Paris was still a medieval city, with its narrow streets and dilapidated housing.
According to eyewitness accounts, you could hardly walk into people's homes, such was the stink. They described rooms in which 12 people sleep, people who don't change their clothes or take off their shoes to sleep, and in the middle of them, a mother breastfeeding her children.
Precarious conditions amid a population explosion triggered by the economic activity in the capital. Fertile ground for the propagation of one particularly despised and deadly disease, cholera.
Tens of thousands of people died in Paris, including the well-off and the more secure. The disease really made its mark during this period.
No one knew where cholera came from or how it spread. But one thing was certain, Paris was in need of major surgery. The daunting task fell to Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte. All too aware that mid-19th century Paris lagged cruelly behind other cities he had visited, like London and New York, France's emperor, driven by the idea of progress, resolved to change things, and fast.
He was very focused on the idea of a large-scale program of works as a way to employ people and to simultaneously improve the social standing of people and to drive growth in the economy.
There's a wonderful story that when he arrives to stand for election, he has a rolled map of Paris under his arm. And when he opens it up, you see these great sort of colored pencil lines, like saber cuts, as Zola will later say, right through the heart of the city. So he does go in there, I think, with a really big idea.
Elected President of the Republic in 1848, he wanted to create a network of wide and bright roads through the capital. Echoing the work of his uncle, Napoleon I, who ruled between 1799 and 1815. Between Place de la Concorde and the Louvre, the emperor opened the first section of the Rue de Rivoli, a large rectilinear trunk road some 900 meters long. It was quite literally a breath of fresh air, bringing Paris to life. The new thoroughfares imagined by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte also needed to be wide, alongside buildings that respected a strict alignment. But the creation of these new boulevards and avenues would come at a price. The very heart of the capital had to be demolished and rebuilt.
Achieving these ends meant issuing compulsory purchase orders to acquire all the land covering the avenue's planned route.
Paris had to wait for a coup. On December 2nd, 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte seized full power. A few months later, in March 1852, he forced through an authoritarian law making it possible for buildings to be expropriated in the public interest. Paris had never experienced anything like it. All that remained was to appoint the ideal candidate to carry out this colossal project. The key man would be a prefect, a native of Paris who spent his entire career working for the state. His name was Georges Eugène Haussmann. In June 1853, when Napoleon III put him in charge of the capital, he was 44 years old and already had his own ideas about town planning.
Haussmann was prefect of the Gironde region. He lived in Bordeaux, a town with large, bright avenues, where the width of the roads was in proportion to the height of the buildings standing alongside them. So when he took over the reins in the capital, it was very much with the idea that Paris could look like Bordeaux.
But how best to decompartmentalize the capital? Haussmann turned to the Simeon Commission's plan, ordered by Napoleon III, which outlined a network of main roads connecting the city's 6 recently built railway stations, such as the Gare de l'Est, which opened in 1849.
All these stations were rail termini for lines heading north, southeast, east and west.
It's all very well spewing streams of passengers onto a railway platform, but what do you do with them? And if a traveller wants to continue their journey, how do they get from one station to another? So linking railway stations was one of the major preoccupations of the great restructuring of Paris.
Haussmann's great public works began as soon as he took office in June 1853. He inherited the ongoing 2-kilometer extension of the Rue de Rivoli, initiated by Napoleon I. The aim was to create a major east-west axis. On top of this, a north-south axis had to be driven through the city center. Boulevard de Sébastopol would make the junction with the Gare de l'Est and be extended to the left bank along Boulevard Saint-Michel. This produced a large cross that would facilitate movement throughout the city. This first network would be the centerpiece of the process.
These thoroughfares cut through an urban fabric which, while dense along the streets, was actually much less so through to the rear of the buildings. Roads could be built through the backyards and relatively open garden spaces.
Haussmann wanted to replace these old Paris houses with what would come to be referred to as Haussmannian constructions, of a type that had actually been springing up in the capital for several decades prior to his arrival. Haussmann did not invent them, but he wanted them to be used systematically, lining his new arteries.
So the idea was to have a not exactly uniform, but a very homogeneous degree of replication in the landscape of the modern Haussmann city.
All the buildings had to be aligned. While their style remained free, the prefect imposed certain rules. On the ground floor would be stores, with a basement beneath. On the second, so-called noble floor, Haussmann insisted on the presence of a long balcony, whose existence owed nothing to chance.
The buildings had to respect an alignment, with their flatness tempered by balconies that also add a little architectural monumentality. There are large full-length windows of the type found in chateaux during the classical era.
The top floor under the roof would also have a balcony, reflecting another Haussmann characteristic. A top floor standing slightly withdrawn relative to the rest of the facade.
The attic had to be set back from the facade of the 4 floors below for a very simple reason: to create an oblique line that would allow the sun to penetrate right into the street. The idea was to allow the air to circulate around the wide thoroughfares and to let the light in from above the high facades.
Haussmann had to work fast to erect these new buildings, as Napoleon III was planning to host a major event in 1855, 2 years later, the World Fair. And the new Paris was to be the highlight of the show.
Being able to host the royalty of the entire world in Paris, and that the host of that was the new Emperor of France, was extraordinarily important to establishing the legitimacy of the regime as a whole.
The world comes to Paris, essentially, and that is part of the importance of his project.
1853, Rue de Rivoli. Hundreds of workers hired by the city worked day and night to build the street and clear the area around the Louvre of the insalubrious homes that had sprung up there like warts over the centuries. And there was not a wrecking ball or a crane in sight. Old Paris was torn down by hand using picks. The working method was simple: start at the top and finish at the bottom in the old-fashioned way.
Remodeling of the city was essentially done by hand in many ways. Basically, you need a lot of workers knocking things down.
The demolition works strike me by the tremendous amount of manual labor involved. And of course, remember that that was part of the objective, right? It was to use these large amounts of labor. So they were not really seeking technological optimization of the construction or the demolition sites.
Napoleon III insisted that the great public works in Paris must also benefit the working classes. But further along the Rue de Rivoli, on the final stretch, Prefect Haussmann faced an unexpected obstacle at the foot of a medieval monument, the Saint-Jacques Tower. Hidden beneath one of the most densely populated districts of Old Paris was a small hillock.
It meant that the Rue de Rivoli either had to be flattened or a hump left in the middle of the street.
The problem was, a hump would ruin the perspective Haussmann wanted.
Bear in mind that when moving around on horse-drawn vehicles, it's extremely hard to climb a hill. And the descent is even more treacherous, because the animal is pushed by whatever load it's meant to be pulling.
Haussmann had no choice. To complete his project, the road had to be flattened. But by fixing one problem, he created another. Now an entire district stood above the level of the new thoroughfare. The only solution was to pull it all down and start again.
That obviously leads to the need to expropriate the adjoining plots of land, to indemnify the owners. It was a big increase in the budget.
In addition to the buildings to be demolished, a stone base had to be added to the Saint-Jacques Tower at its foundations to raise it up to the level of the new road. This brought the cost up to 30 million francs from the original budget of 18 million. Any further such oversights would be disastrous for the finances of the city. But it was obvious where the root of the problem lay.
Unfortunately, the plans of the city did not record its topography.
Haussmann thus commissioned an ultra-precise map of the city using the triangulation method, a technique known since ancient times but never used to map Paris. Topographers worked using a series of 3 points. First, they measured the distance between 2 of them on the ground. Once that was known, they measured the angle separating the 2 points from the third, from an elevated position. Using trigonometric calculations, they were thus able to determine the distance between them from the third point, allowing it to be accurately positioned on a map. In the second stage, the topographers completed the triangulation by measuring levels. A simple operation carried out using telescopes and graduated sights. These calculations produced Haussmann's map of Paris, the first to offer a 3-dimensional perspective of the city, thanks to the levels indicated in red. It would prove to be an invaluable weapon in his public works project.
It's very interesting to see that through that, Haussmann started developing a methodology that we still in effect use today, still refined further, but for large-scale urban projects, that you really have to do the fundamental work of establishing the land that you're working on and all the parameters before you get going.
Haussmann pressed ahead, but less than a year after taking office, he faced another problem. The state could not finance all the construction work. He needed to find developers ready to put their hands in their pockets to erect these new buildings. And they weren't exactly banging on Haussmann's door to offer funding.
It doesn't come easy. It doesn't all fall into place terribly easy. With retrospect, we think, oh, it just was bound to happen. It wasn't bound to happen. A lot of people are going to be very skeptical about the story that they're being told, and perhaps rightly so initially.
Haussmann then turned to 2 rising stars of French finance, the Perret brothers, Émile and Isaac.
Perret brothers are fascinating characters. They arrived in Paris in poverty, and they were responsible for the first passenger railway line in the Paris region, and used that to start build up to what would be an enormous fortune.
Unlike traditional banks, theirs, the Crédit Mobilier, was listed on the Paris Stock Exchange. This gave the Perret brothers far more scope to considerably increase the money at their disposal. It was a financial windfall that strengthened their hand in negotiations with Haussmann.
The Perret brothers, in the event, bought a large piece of land. They would then do the development, build the buildings, using capital that was raised on the equity markets, and then sell back the buildings to investors.
Thanks to the Perret brothers' money, workers and scaffolding transformed the center of Paris into a gigantic construction site. Floor by floor, the first buildings of the Rue de Rivoli began to rise out of the ground. Their freestone facades made them instantly recognizable to the people of Paris.
The masonry in Paris has a very characteristic light beige color. This limestone, with its very characteristic blonde color, sourced in the Paris region and beyond, helps give the Paris landscape its uniformity.
The roofs of the new buildings were made to slope at a 45-degree angle. For the first time, the people of Paris saw the widespread use of a new material that would make the city's roofs the stuff of legend: zinc.
The use of zinc made it possible to incorporate angles and accommodate the profile of buildings. It's very efficient and durable, and setting the grey patina of the zinc against the blondness of the masonry gives the characteristic grey-blonde effect typical of the visual image of Haussmann's Paris.
The work on the Rue de Rivoli, the main artery in the first network that was to be the basis for everything else, produced a complete transformation of Paris. But at what cost? In 1855, after 3 years of construction and the demolition of several hundred properties, the buildings of the Rue de Rivoli finally rose from the debris in time for the World Fair. The whole world was given its first glimpse of a thoroughfare that extended along more than 3 kilometers. It was groundbreaking.
This series of buildings with a continuous line of balconies on the 2nd and 5th floors, set back under the roof on the same floor, the 5th, created what was, at the time, an absolutely astonishing vista.
All public areas now had monuments, and the modest residential buildings became part of this landscape.
It was a street that the people of Paris were eager to see, walk up and down, and wander along, because it offered so much more than just a show.
When the Rue de Rivoli was first opened, the just disbelief of the people to be able to cross from what's today the Place de la Concorde to the Place de la Bastille in a matter of minutes without stopping on an enormous, flat, wide road, for them that was just inconceivable to do that.
With the boulevards Sebastopol and Saint-Michel under construction, it was now only a matter of time before the first network was complete. Success was already assured for both the emperor and for Haussmann. And it was only the beginning. In mid-1850, Haussmann had another operation underway. His objective was to revive what was a vital organ for the capital. Not far from the new main intersection stood the Church of Saint-Eustache. Ever since the 12th century, the area beside it had been the site of an extremely disorganized food market.
Before Les Halles was established, it was just a mass of movable wooden trestle tables amid a few wooden shelters in a grimy setting.
For Napoleon III, who liked to foster an image as a despot who was sympathetic to the people, replacing them with a functional infrastructure and symbol of modernity became a matter of urgency. In the early 1850s, the architect Victor Baltard was assigned with the task. In 1852, the first structure was erected. But thanks to its imposing stonework architecture, the people soon began referring to it as the Market Fort.
Napoleon knew the building was unpopular. According to Haussmann, he said, "It's vast umbrellas that I need, nothing more."
Napoleon III sketched out the vast umbrellas for Haussmann. Summoned by the prefect in 1853, Baltard was tasked with delivering a new project and in record time. Construction had to begin as soon as possible. He succeeded brilliantly. His 24-meter-high pavilions all had the same features. Down below, in the vast cellars, food could be stored and cheese matured. At ground level, enclosures made from bricks and louvered shutters allowed the air to circulate. The glass allowed light to enter, while the whole was supported by a cast iron structure that was both sturdy and airy.
The use of metal meant that walls or columns of relatively thick stone could be replaced by much more slender cast iron pillars. This freed up space and allowed the light in. By combining these iron pillars, which resist compression much better than stone pillars, with iron frames and with glass, which could now be produced on an industrial scale, large areas could be covered with very few points of support. The resulting lightness and transparency produced architecture that was both visually stunning and extremely functional.
Thanks to the use of metal, the Les Halles market covered an area of some 40,000 square meters. The project, which began in 1853, rapidly became the largest in Paris. In addition to the 90,000 cubic meters of soil excavated and removed, it consumed 600 tons of cast iron, 700 tons of iron girders, 18,000 cubic meters of concrete, as well as 1.8 million bricks. Of the 12 pavilions, by 1857, 8 had already been built. The others would be completed later. As described by author Émile Zola, Les Halles became the belly of Paris.
It appeared like some vast modern machine, a steam engine or a cauldron supplying the digestive needs of a whole people, a huge metal belly, bolted and riveted, constructed of wood, glass and iron, with the elegance and power of a mechanical engine.
But for Haussmann, the city center markets brought another problem.
Food was transported by cart. So you really had to imagine an incoming flow and outgoing flow.
The market became part of a new urban scheme, one that allowed Les Halles to act as a wholesale market, supplying other markets scattered around Paris.
As a symbol of the restoration of Paris, the Central Market attained legendary status. It's a myth that now has been consigned to the past. In 1969, it was decided to move the market to Rungis, just outside Paris. The iron and steel masterpiece designed by Victor Baltard was duly demolished. By 1858, Paris's City Hall was in turmoil. Haussmann had just approved another hellish series of works. On the left bank, he was preparing to construct several new major arteries. On the right bank, he continued to open up the railway stations, creating new connection hubs. Paris was extending its arms. This was what became known as the Second Network.
Once you've created this big cross in Paris by using secondary roads, you can serve either the very densely populated districts not connected to the heart of the city, or create new districts that will need links to the city centre.
To finance this second network incorporating the rest of the city, Haussmann put the municipality in debt to the tune of 180 million francs, a real fortune.
You'll take a financial hit first, but things will change as a result. He makes Paris desirable to live in a way that then produces enormous rise in property prices. And this will generate resources which allow the city to prosper, to grow again.
Napoleon III and Haussmann were planning a revolution. Their intention was to annex Paris from the territory separating the city from the fortifications that constituted its frontier. With the stroke of a pen, the area of the capital doubled in size, while its population increased from 1 to 1.7 million inhabitants. Work on the second network, which began in 1858, would transform the whole face of the capital. But how to make this new Paris understandable to its residents? How to help them find their way around? Haussmann's answer was to use monuments. Old or new, they became targets that the new arteries must aim for. The most emblematic of them would be the Paris Opera, a colossal building 173 meters long and 125 meters wide.
It indicates not only direction, it also indicates the scope of the new road. It adds a kind of majesty by giving an idea of its length.
These landmark monuments became one of Haussmann's obsessions. He wanted them everywhere, even where they were impossible. As evidenced by the dome of the commercial court on the Ile de la Cité, which Haussmann shifted to one side.
Haussmann shifted it far enough to the right to make sure it was right in line with the boulevard de Sébastopol to create a line of sight effect.
While occasionally excessive, the idea of filling Paris with monuments gave rise to some real feats of architecture, such as the Saint-Augustin Church, often ignored by Parisians. It is home to the largest dome in Paris, 26 meters in diameter and almost 80 meters high.
Thousands and thousands of people go by it. Most people think it's much older than it actually is, and most people don't really look at how it's designed.
More than just a church, Saint-Augustin is an outstanding technical feat. Designed by architect Victor Baltard, it owes its existence to the extension of Boulevard Malesherbes. This is a road that Haussmann intended to divide into two branches to serve new districts. In doing so, the fork created a void.
It was seen as an opportunity to take something which is an imperfection and turn it into something special.
While the idea for a second branch turned out to be problematic and was eventually abandoned, Haussmann pressed ahead with the church, and construction began in 1860. Napoleon III even planned to make it his final resting place, a mausoleum honoring the glory of Bonaparte. It needed to be a monumental construction, visible from all over Paris, and be topped off with a dome. Any mausoleum worth its salt had to bear comparison with the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, the tomb of the apostles St. Peter and St. Paul, with its imposing dome that reaches out to pilgrims. Fully aware that he could not make it as imposing, Victor Baltard was also aware that it would not escape comparison. The main problem, and it was a big one, was the site at the corner of Boulevard Malesherbes, which was hardly the Vatican.
Baltard saw that Haussmann had given him a narrow plot of land to build this monument on, one that was also a very strange shape, a kind of polygon, like a cork. On the map, it looks most peculiar.
It is a horrible site. It's a quite a small footprint stuck between roads that is highly constraining for the architect, whereas simultaneously he had instructions to make something as grand and as visible as possible.
How to make this monument visible? How to erect an imposing dome on a narrow strip of land without the aid of buttresses to stabilize the structure? Baltard met the challenge with a unique piece of architecture. At the heart of his design was a gigantic metal hall. At the top, tension-resisting steel arches spread the entire weight of the structure across columns made from cast iron, an alloy that is particularly resistant to the forces of compression.
He uses the metal in order to go very high, to create volumes and to give effects of light. So to create a remarkable space.
This metal hall, invisible from the outside, serves as the backbone. It allows an imposing volume to be erected and supported using very few materials. To finish it off, the stone surrounding the structure gives it a solemn and imperial character.
Basically, it's a kind of stone hull supported inside by a metal structure. The stone architecture is supported by the cast iron, and without it, the church would collapse. It is a work of genius, because it is a hybrid that harnesses all the modern techniques of the day.
Baltard used the same system of cast iron columns to carry the imposing dome. In order to make it as lightweight as possible without forfeiting strength, the structure was constructed entirely of metal. St. Augustine's dome, unlike a masonry dome, causes no downward pressure. It is structurally autonomous, as if laid on the building. Opened in 1860, the Church of St. Augustin was completed after the fall of the Empire in 1870. With its dome measuring 26 meters in diameter, St. Augustin dominates the Paris skyline. While at street level, the church acts as a landmark.
People like a city that they can understand, and I think St. Augustin makes an important contribution to understanding the image of the city.
Is a new legibility of the city, an understanding of how the city is connected up through these boulevards, these monuments. You always know roughly where you are. They re-script the city to really force the symbolic aspects of power or into the eye, I guess, of the flaneur.
While St. Augustin never became a mausoleum for the deposed Emperor Napoleon III, who died in Britain in 1873, the church remains one of Victor Baltard's most impressive technical achievements. One of these landmark target monuments would come to be regarded as the most impressive achievement of the Second Network, the Place de l'Étoile, site of the Arc de Triomphe. Commissioned by Napoleon I to celebrate France's victory of Austerlitz in 1805, this 50-meter-high colossus was completed in 1836. Since the First Empire, almost nothing had been built in the surrounding area.
There it was, in the middle of an area with no grandeur, almost a vacant lot that forms a shapeless square.
A dedicated Bonapartist, Haussmann planned to give this masterpiece of stone the setting it deserved.
Haussmann created a square with 12 avenues radiating out of it, as if Paris was extending its arms. It was absolutely majestic. The kind of gigantic square that had never been seen before, except maybe at St. Peter's in Rome.
A target monument serving 12 avenues, the Place de l'Étoile became the hub around which the smart districts of Western Paris were structured. In addition to these 12 avenues, the monument would be set off by 12 buildings, each only 3 stories high. Designed by architect Jacques Itoff, they stand a little further back to better show off the Arc de Triomphe. On the ground, Haussmann planted trees to give some volume to the vast square.
Until Haussmann came along, a square was a meeting place, a theatre of ceremonies, of festivities, of power. Haussmann squares had none of that. They were crossroads, hubs of communication. People circulated, but they passed through. There was nothing to see.
Haussmann wanted to bring unity to a city that was extending further and further, faster and faster. This would be the avant-garde role of street furniture, so much in evidence today that it has become almost invisible. It is omnipresent. From benches to street lamps, to the grids at the feet of the trees now scattered around the city.
Paris at the time had a department of architects and designers who were in a position to do the design themselves. And that had an enormous impact.
Wherever you ventured, right through the city, in any district, this urban furniture was the same. Haussmann's genius was to have conceived the city as an intrinsic, indivisible whole, complete in itself.
But before completing the second network and turning definitively to the new Paris, Haussmann still had one last score to settle with the old city. Between the Ile de la Cité, the traditional center of the capital, and its prefect, it was almost a personal matter. It harked back to his student years, when he walked through it daily on his way to law school.
Having left the Chaussée d'Antin quarter this morning, I was walking alongside the old courtrooms with, on my left, the despicable heap which not long ago brought dishonor on the city, a haven for thieves and murderers who seem to flout the attentions of the police and the criminal courts.
During the 1860s, Haussmann razed to the ground almost the entire island, preserving only its monuments. He made it the city's administrative center, with police headquarters, a commercial court, and some spanking new law courts. The size of the square in front of Notre Dame Cathedral was increased 6-fold, but better to show off the monument, where restoration work had been underway since 1844, overseen by architect Viollet-le-Duc. He was the man responsible for the steeple made from timber and lead that rose up in 1868, a structure that would be destroyed in the Great Fire of Notre Dame on April 15, 2019. Haussmann demolished a whole neighborhood nearby in order to rebuild the Hôtel Dieu, the historic hospital in the center of Paris, which was also torn down.
I've never been able to forget this insalubrious section of river, tucked between two hospital buildings and polluted by every type of excrement from the 800 patients within.
In all, nearly 10,000 residents were forced to give up their homes, evicted from the island. The city's residents, who had welcomed the public works with open arms, were by now in a state of shock.
He was seen as a destroyer. I mean, the nickname was the Alsatian Attila. You know, he came through like a Hun, really, you know, sort of no sense of history, sort of destroying to right and left to build this new functional city.
A destroyer to some, a modernizer to others, Haussmann's transformation of the Ile de la Cité was the most controversial aspect of the great works of Paris. And while he built a city of light, the work on the second network also had a dark side. The Richard Lenoir vault, for example, an underground construction forbidden to the public. Built between 1860 and 1862, it totals 1.7 kilometers in length and covers the Canal Saint-Martin. It owes its existence to the construction of Boulevard Voltaire, which connects the Place de la République to the Square Nation, across the Canal Saint-Martin. The canal proved problematic for Prefect Haussmann, who was anxious to control the working-class districts to the east of the city.
The Canal Saint-Martin cuts right through Paris, and it's very difficult to move troops across it. You'd have to basically cross bridges, and if you're crossing bridges, then bridges can be either set fire to or barricaded or whatever.
To run his new thoroughfare across the waterway, Haussmann gave up on the idea of a bridge and decided to cover it. To that end, he created a new artery, the Boulevard Richard Lenoir. This provided multiple crossing points to allow troops to circulate freely in the working-class districts to the east in the event of insurrection. To that end, workers lowered the level of the canal by 5 meters before covering it with a gigantic millstone vault along a 1.7-kilometer stretch. It was a massive civil engineering project that had the workers of Paris laboring to ensure that they and their kind could be kept under control.
Thousands of men were at work, with some very serious accidents. They were 10 meters above the bottom of the canal. Some men fell, others injured themselves shifting masonry and the like.
The workers had to pay a high price to fulfill the Baron's vision of Paris as a bourgeois capital. As a result of the major public works, the poorest were left by the wayside. In 1868, Émile Zola wrote,
"Not for their benefit has the city been cleaned up. Every new boulevard drives them in greater numbers into the faubourg."
Haussmann accepted this reality in a letter to the emperor.
There is no need for Paris to contain factories and workshops. Hence, the great works must not only be continued, they must be hastened to defend Paris against the growing invasion of workers from the provinces.
The other idea is cram the bourgeoisie in. So essentially give them a style of life, a home and a style of life in which they'll feel comfortable.
The creation of the second network was a triumph for the Haussmannian buildings springing up all over Paris, especially in the smart districts to the west. But not all residents were in the same boat. While the bourgeoisie occupied the main floors, the servants were crammed in under the eaves in attic garrets. A symbol of this acute inequality was the fact that the buildings had 2 staircases, a main one for the bourgeois occupants and the back stairs for use by the servants.
Domesticity was kept out of sight for the main residence, meaning all the amenities were shunted out to the rear, as well as the comings and goings of servants, who had to use a hidden staircase to access their rooms. This is the paradox of the 19th century. It's an era devoted entirely to progress, but not for all.
It was the price to be paid for making the new Paris one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Once the 26 kilometers of works on the second network were concluded in the late 1860s, Haussmann was unstoppable. To complete his new city, he planned to create a third network of arteries, which would not be finished until 1926. With its large arteries acting as lungs, Haussmann successfully aired Paris in its entirety. But he also watered it. The Yonne region, 150 kilometers from Paris, is home to a little-known component of Haussmann's great works. This underground structure, built in the early 1870s, is still functional 150 years after being put into service. Paris was, at last, going to have a supply of clean water.
People realized that the best water was spring water, groundwater that had not been polluted by activities on the surface, so the water had to arrive pure, fresh, without organic matter.
This infrastructure carries water from the Amantière spring through 500 meters of underground tunnels driven through the heart of the Massif, which provide the capital with nearly 30,000 cubic meters of water per day, or nearly 10% of the total water consumed by Parisians since the 19th century. Giving Paris access to clean water was one of Haussmann's greatest achievements. To bring it to the city, his engineer, Eugène Belgrand, set about building a colossal aqueduct more than 150 kilometers long. It boasted lifting devices, bridges, and siphons to carry it across valleys.
The engineers on the ground produced gradients and created watercourses with the help of an incredible mass of humanity, digging, building and erecting scaffolding. It was a colossal undertaking, and what they accomplished still survives today. The structure is completely sustainable and will be passed on to future generations.
The highlight of the project was the construction of the Montsouris Reservoir on the high ground to the south of Paris. With a surface area of 3 hectares, this colossus has a maximum capacity of 1 billion liters. It remains a vital piece of infrastructure and demonstrates the sustainability of the city rebuilt by Baron Haussmann. Just like his buildings still standing today, or the 380 kilometers of sewers that helped clean up the city. Resourceful and visionary, the Baron was both a destroyer and the man who gave the capital its distinctive identity. Regardless of the dark side, in the eyes of the world, Haussmann turned Paris into the city of light. Paris would not be Paris without its emblematic monuments, its large avenues, and its sublime quays on the Seine. What we're not necessarily aware of is that Paris owes these to Emperor Napoleon I, who reigned from 1799 to 1815. He wanted to make Paris an international capital, modern, with monumental buildings. If it weren't for him, there'd be no Arc de Triomphe. a giant 164 feet tall building with colossal foundations. It took 30 years to build.
Now, the Arc de Triomphe, when it's completed, will be shock and awe for anyone who comes to Paris. This is the monument to the Grande Armée and what it did to its enemies.
The emperor created the Madeleine, a 355 feet long temple of antique architecture, whose area equals that of Paris Notre Dame and hides an exceptional device.
Without this metal frame, without this system of armored stone, the whole colonnade would collapse in the street.
Testimony to the civil engineering of Bonaparte, the first big Parisian main street half a mile long was created from scratch, Rue de Rivoli.
What really distinguishes Rue de Rivoli is its width, its height, and its rectilinear layout. The magnificence of this monumental street brings air and life to Paris.
Under his reign, Paris will become a capital worthy of antique Rome, as shown by the 145 feet Vendôme Column.
What's needed are monuments that proclaim the power of his regime and army.
Bonaparte was also a pioneer in sourcing drinking water in Paris, thanks to the Ourcq Canal, which is more than 62 miles long.
You are going to come into this city and you are going to see brand spanking modernity that you don't have. You're also going to see power, and it emanates from me.
Unique architecture, the latest technology, whilst in the background deadly wars are being fought. This is the story of Napoleon I's Paris. (1816) St. Helena Island. Exiled in the middle of the Atlantic, Napoleon I has laid down his arms. However, he's not just thinking about his stinging defeat. He's thinking of Paris.
It's my constant dream to make it the true capital of Europe. Something fabulous, colossal, never seen before.
Napoleon didn't have time to realize his imperial capital, but he laid the groundwork. The history of the emperor and Paris begins in a city of which very few traces remain. A medieval city with narrow, dark streets. A real shambles.
You have to imagine Paris at the end of the 18th century as a Paris which is pitch black at night, a Paris which is still dangerous. All the work of Napoleon and his successors, and rightly so, will consist of opening up Paris, bringing fresh air, and installing monuments.
If one place incarnates the ambition of Napoleon as regards Paris, it's the Place de l'Étoile, the birthplace of the Arc de Triomphe.
The Arc de Triomphe has absolutely extraordinary dimensions. 164 feet height, 147 feet wide, and 72 feet deep, so it's absolutely insane.
All around the Arc de Triomphe, the major axes. The Avenue de la Grande Armée, the Avenue de Wagram, the Avenue de Friedland. They proclaim the military victories of the empire, and it is not by accident. This colossal monument owes everything to a major event, a turning point in the history of France and of Napoleon's, the Battle of Austerlitz. In 1805, France is a country at odds with Europe. It is ruled by a military man who has fought nearly 10 years for the French Revolution. He had several victories before becoming first consul in 1799, then emperor in 1804. At the time, France reigns over a significant territory which extends from Belgium to the north of Italy. To strengthen his power in Europe, Napoleon prepares to invade Great Britain. At the camp at Boulogne-sur-Mer, he assembles his great army, 190,000 men.
It's all set up, ready to go. They've been training for 3 years now, so they're very, very good, these guys. And he reckons that once you get to the south of England, it's an easy job to get to London. No one will stop me. There's no army.
Aware of the danger, the British form an alliance with Russia and Austria to defeat the Great Army. So Napoleon brutally changes his strategy. On the 2nd of December 1805, he gains a crushing victory at Austerlitz, which is part of what is now the Czech Republic, exactly 1 year to the day of his coronation.
Austerlitz was a vindication of the years, literally years, of hard training when he took raw conscripts, boys straight from the farms, and turned them into the greatest military machine Europe had ever seen, a weapon of mass destruction. They were going to come back to Paris, to his capital, as heroes, and they were going to show both Paris and the whole of France what this new regime was made of.
To celebrate this victory, which alone symbolizes the power of his empire, the emperor decrees in the month of February 1806 the construction of 2 Arcs de Triomphe, or triumphal arches, one of which will be on l'Étoile.
These triumphal arches initiated by Rome have remained through the ages the architecture of a victorious army.
The first arch, called the Carrousel, is relatively modest with a height of 62 feet, a width of 75 feet, a depth of 23 feet, and equipped with 3 arcades. It will be built in front of the imperial residence of the Tuileries Palace, within the confines of the Louvre.
It's a great success on the part of Napoleon and his architects, who were Percier and Fontaine. They succeeded in creating on a site opposite the Tuileries, which no longer exists and which was Napoleon's palace, an Arc de Triomphe based on the human scale, perfectly successful in its architecture, perfectly balanced.
But for the second one, Napoleon pictures a magisterial arch, worthy of the tremendous victory at Austerlitz. It's the most imposing monument that he will leave for posterity. A reminder for centuries to come of the feat of arms of his great army. An arch which the emperor pictures in the east of Paris on Place de la Bastille, on the site of the ancient fortress, symbol of the ancient regime, which fell on the 14th of July, 1789.
This project strongly displeased Champagny, who was the Minister of the Interior at the time, who was in charge of the large-scale public works, because he knew that such an enormous arch in a fairly closed-off area was not going to have perspective, and that was not the aim.
Before deciding where to place the monumental arch, a commission is gathered. On the suggestion of the future architect of the monument, Jean-François Chalgrin, the commission will recommend to Napoleon to build the arch not in the east of the capital, but to the west entrance of the city, still hardly built up, at the top of a hill, Place de l'Étoile.
Napoleon comes to realize that not only is he going to get Paris to see the instrument of valorization of his conquests, but he's also going to showcase it outside Paris, so basically to the rest of the world.
By building it there, Napoleon is completing that, what you might call, line that was traced by a hand of genius under Louis XIV, that runs from the Louvre to Tuileries, through the gardens, up the Champs-Élysées to the top of the hill. There is now something at the top of the hill that completes that panorama.
Napoleon will be able to admire this arch from his residence at the Tuileries Palace. In order for it to be seen, it must, therefore, have colossal dimensions. Whereas the biggest Arc de Triomphe of ancient Rome is 82 feet high, the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile will be twice as big and will reach a height of 164 feet.
At that time, to construct a building out of scale is perfectly consistent and appropriate with the political discourse that Napoleon wants to keep, which is to assert his power on the whole world.
Now, the Arc de Triomphe, when it's completed, will be shock and awe for anyone who comes to Paris, particularly a foreigner. This is what I did. Don't you dare try anything again.
The first stone of this exceptional monument will be placed as early as May 1806. However, its definitive form is not yet finished. Only its gigantic dimensions of 164 feet high, 147 feet wide, and 73 feet deep, and its tetrapylon character with its 4 arcades oriented east to west and north to south have been agreed upon. With such dimensions, the structure will come close to 100,000 tons. 100,000 tons of material, of which half will be invisible, buried 26 feet under the ground.
The foundations are colossal in terms of dimensions and weight. So for the most structural parts of the foundation work, that is to say, most angles and some edges, an enormous stone will be used. However, filling the entire foundation is sometimes done with more heterogeneous materials, whose role is primarily to add some weight, to properly secure the foundations to the ground.
The construction of this exceptional monument will be entrusted to one of the best architects in Paris, the architect who had the idea of locating the arch at the top of the Champs-Élysées, Jean-François Chalgrin. In order to increase the shock effect and admiration caused by the monument, he will give it simple forms with clear lines to portray its volume as comprehensible as possible.
It's got to be simple. There's no need to be ornate. That smacks of the past. A simple, straight, direct statement. That was the Roman way, that was the Greek way.
There's no need for fancy decor as regards this big space. Its size says it all.
But very quickly, the size of the Arc de Triomphe poses a problem for the architect. The colossal archway will reach 82 feet high and must support the weight of the structure. A problem emerges. It will exert strong pressure towards the ground. So how to contain it? The architect has a bright idea. Its feet will be massive.
We need the maximum weight possible in the structure, where this oblique appears, to pull down the force, right down to the foundations. We need a massive structure which is completely overloaded with building material.
In the upper part of the structure, Chalgrin will create space with the use of rooms. Chalgrin knows that this monument will be built to last, so the choice of materials is crucial. That's why he decides to build it out of dimension stone, and not just any stone, white stone called Château-Landon stone.
It's a stone whose great virtue is that it's very tough. The material must really be able to withstand very high compression rates. And finally, I think the choice of the stone is linked to the notion of facing masonry. That's to say, the finishing that Chalgrin wished to implement.
If the works on the Arc de Triomphe start in 1806, and his solid plans are never contradicted, Napoleon is unaware that he will never see its completion. Due to political reasons, this work, which will go through thousands of workers, will last 30 years. Intoxicated by the Austerlitz victory, the emperor orders another monument in parallel to the construction of the Arc. a huge column which dominates the heart of the capital from the center of Place Vendôme. Inspired by the Emperor Trajan column in Rome, the Vendôme Column is over 140 feet with a diameter of 10 feet. Its 787 feet long decoration celebrates the epic that was this victorious campaign. It's made with bronze from cannons captured from the Austrians and the Russians. At its summit, Napoleon places a statue where he is represented in the guise of a Roman emperor. It is one of the rare statues of him which survives today in the capital.
Napoleon knows that to be immortal, he must create prestigious monuments. Monuments which, to some extent, vaunt the power of his regime and army.
To build this monument, erected on the location of an old statue of King Louis XIV and destroyed during the Revolution, the workers start by checking the foundations. At a depth of 98 feet, they are considered fit to accommodate this monument. The column itself is made from dimension stone. Its bronze decor, divided into 425 plaques, is fixed to the stone with clamps. Initiated in 1806, the works will be completed with the help of enormous scaffolding. It will take 4 years. During this time, the tension between European powers will allow Napoleon to amass new military victories. Victories which will allow the erection of new monuments to his glory and to that of his great army. During the year of 1806, Prussia declares war on Napoleon. A flash campaign follows, during which the emperor crushes the Prussian army, the most reputed in Europe, in Jena on the 14th of October. Less than a year after Austerlitz, who would have believed such a victory?
It was something quite incredible, and it was necessary to mark that in the urban Parisian landscape by something which made a link between this worship of antiquity, this worship of the Roman army, with a modern worship for a modern army, which was the Great Army.
It's a new antique-inspired monument with crazy dimensions that Napoleon decides to erect. A temple dedicated to the glory of the army, which would become the Madeleine Church. The monument, built in the pure Greco-Roman style, occupies the same superficial measure as the nave of Notre Dame Cathedral. 354 feet long, 141 feet wide, 98 feet high. With its pediment, its portico, and its 52 Corinthian columns, this monument will contribute in turn to make Paris the imperial capital which Napoleon dreams of.
The only paradigm is Rome. We live through something that is absolutely unique. Nobody has ever done what we've done. We can't explain ourselves to our sons, we can't explain ourselves to our parents. The only reference we have to the rest of history is ancient Rome.
In 1807, a competition is organized. Among the candidates, the architect Pierre-Alexandre Vignon, 43 years old. The Temple of Glory could be the chance of a lifetime. He will work non-stop to deliver a pure project, monumental, a perfect imitation of a Greco-Roman temple. Although Pierre-Alexandre Vignon only wins second place in the competition, it is, however, his project that the emperor will set his sights on.
It had to be something that did not detract from the purpose, and that was to class these people with classical heroes. That was to bracket them with the bravest soldiers of Greece and Rome in the same way, but not to overshadow it and overawe it with anything inconsequential.
The antique temple, designed by Vignon, will consist of an imposing stylobate of 27 steps. At the center, a cella represents the heart of the building. Surrounded by a portico of 52 columns, it will be fitted with 3 cupolas. These cupolas will be equipped with oculi, which will allow the light to penetrate the building deprived of windows. A device directly inspired by one of the oldest Roman monuments still intact, the Pantheon.
In the Madeleine, the only way to illuminate is effectively by zenithal lighting. The technique of the time permits this, as there's iron, there's glass, all these new products which effectively permit illumination by zenithal very easily. And as the temple is long, we will create 3 cupolas, but without a dome. But the 3 cupolas, turned towards the sky, are ultimately 3 times that of the Pantheon.
This zenithal lighting, thanks to the 3 cupolas, allow to better understand the function that Napoleon wanted to give to this monumental building. More than just a temple dedicated to the glory of the army, the future Madeleine Church would have been, above all, a mausoleum to the glory of the soldiers of the empire fallen on the field of honor.
The French army, the French soldiers, my men, have given their lives. These men have died and given their blood to protect it. It's not so much about my glory. It's about our sacrifice. Something permanent has to be done for these guys.
But where to construct this temple of glory? Napoleon finds the solution in the area west of the capital. It's here that since the middle of the 18th century, a new monumental church is supposed to be built. A number of works had already been started, but the French Revolution put an end to it. This abandoned building site offers an ideal location for the temple in alignment with the Place de la Concorde, in front of which Napoleon orders the construction of a new facade to the building which will mirror the other side of the square, the Palais Bourbon.
This palace, in fact, presented an anomaly. It was angled in relation to the quays, so it didn't present its facade opposite the Madeleine church. And for an era passionate about classicism, architecture perfectly positioned, the symmetry didn't work.
Thanks to these 2 antique temples whose colonnades mirror each other, the Place de la Concorde stands out as the pivot, the patella of Napoleon I's imperial Paris.
So here we are between 2 Greco-Roman inspired monuments that Napoleon wanted. He placed one at the end of the Concorde Bridge, built under the Ancien Régime, with Rue Royale in its axis. But these 2 monuments, this tension which they induce, also correspond to another great monument, the Arc de Triomphe. So we have these great monuments which are going to make a monumental impression on this space.
Therefore, the future Madeleine Church will impose itself as one of the main connections to Napoleon's monumental Paris. However, behind its apparent simplicity, it will create a problem to its architect. Firstly, where to find the ideal stone.
It's imperative to know that an antique temple is made of elements of great importance. That is, marble stone. In Athens, marble allows the crossing of spaces like that, with a single stone, like a beam.
However, the architect didn't have access to Athens marble. He must make do with limestone from the Paris basin.
Paris stone is a very different stone which doesn't allow for the monumentality of massive marble stones. Here we have 10 feet, and the columns are around 6.5 feet in diameter. So to get over 10 feet, it's impossible to do it with one single stone from the Paris basin.
Consequently, how to hold up the edifice? The challenge is to assure the maintenance of the elements constituting the portico of the temple, an area which connects the central cella to the colonnade of the monument, separated by 10 feet of empty space. Vignon finds the solution in the attic of the edifice, a vaulted and empty space just above the portico. It's this space that the architect will equip with a metal frame of surprising modernity.
This process is already known, but Vignon will perfect and develop it here on a colossal scale on this magnificent building. So under my feet, if we had a scanner, we would see the presence of iron.
Invisible to the naked eye, it is this armature which will assure the support of the building. This metal spider's web is incorporated in the entire surface of the ceiling. However, to be effective, it must be stretched at its extremities by other thrusts. This will be the role of the vaults that will support them, assuring the maintenance of the ceiling above the portico.
Without this metal frame, without this system of armored stone, well, the whole colonnade would collapse in the street.
Another challenge, what material to use for the roof structure of the building? In the previous century, it's wood that would naturally have been chosen. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, passionate about modernity, Vignon will choose iron, a material more resistant to fires and parasites. Thanks to the progress of the iron and steel industry, these elements developed in a foundry were then assembled on site.
The system is perfectly balanced. It's a draft blueprint placed on the structure in stone that itself has its thrusts, also managed by the hidden iron. It's a very political program, inhabited by modernity and the leap forward that Napoleon wants to propel on the French society in all domains, including the domain of arts and science, since that's also his signature.
The building work starts in 1808 and is finished in 1842. What Napoleon does not know is that some years later the monument will change function. Following the disastrous campaign in Russia in 1812, the Temple of Glory will finally become the Madeleine Church on his impulsion. For Napoleon to make Paris the capital of Europe, he cannot just build imposing monuments. Throughout his reign, he never stopped setting up numerous works in the capital to make it a practical city, well spaced in the image of its great rival, London. He built a number of infrastructures, markets, cemeteries like Père Lachaise, and even slaughterhouses. It is also Napoleon who will build the quays along the Seine, riverbanks that until then had offered a sight worthy of the Middle Ages.
It's really about modernizing the city, to make the city flow with movement, both on the river, but also by creating one of the largest streets. And finally, it's an entire system with the creation of markets, the enlarging of the streets, etc. It's a system of global modernization.
And that starts as soon as he rises to power, before he becomes emperor. In 1799, when he becomes, by coup d'etat, the first consul of the French Republic. Amongst the works of the consulate, one of them will drastically change the physiognomy of the capital forever, Rue de Rivoli. It stretches half a mile from the Louvre until the Place de la Concorde.
What really really distinguishes Rue de Rivoli is its width, its size, and its rectilinear layout. The magnificence of this monumental street, which has been compared to a powerful ventilator which brings with it air and life into Paris.
It's a very revolutionary street for the time, with its arcades to protect the pedestrian, its shops inspired a bit by the Italians. Remember that Bonaparte did a campaign in Italy before becoming Napoleon.
It's not there by chance. It's in the heart of the capital, in the Tuileries Palace, where King Louis XVI was overthrown in 1792, that the first consul is living. No longer here today, it was adjoined to the Louvre in an area which showed a totally different face.
The area is principally made up of a maze of narrow, winding streets. On the Tuileries side, there are especially large plots of nationalized buildings, so there are convents, the Feuillants, the Assomption, the Capucines, and there are also mansions. On the Louvre side, the urban fabric is denser, so we have especially old buildings everywhere, representative of old Paris. Incidentally, Balzac will describe this area as an ocean of cobblestones.
This area especially witnessed a bloody event which marked Bonaparte, then a general of the Revolution. It's the Royalist insurrection of October 9, 1795, the 13th Vendémiaire of year 4, according to the revolutionary calendar in use at the time. A day which will drastically change the destiny of the young General Bonaparte on Rue Saint-Honoré at the foot of the Church of Saint-Roch.
Very well armed, very well organized bourgeois militias from the western suburbs of Paris organized a rising specifically to overthrow the government. That is the moment when he is summoned from obscurity to put them down.
Actually, we can still see a few marks today. The impact of the bullets fired on the crowd by Bonaparte's forces who were posted at the end of the streets, which led to the Convention. So these are the traces of this bloody event.
The event of Vendémiaire made Bonaparte a hero of the Revolution. However, he remained the sworn enemy of the Royalists.
The quartier around Rivoli, it's part of those right-wing bourgeois suburbs that he crushed in Vendémiaire. He's going in there to destroy what he saw as a nest of dangerous right-wing royalism, which of course is right across the street from his office in the Tuileries, right across from where he sleeps.
By destroying the area around the Tuileries to create Rue de Rivoli, Bonaparte, now first consul, will kill two birds with one stone. To impose his power to the area west of the city, populated by royalists, but also to materialize with stone the ambition of his new regime. Napoleon will entrust these works to Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, two men who will impose themselves as official architects of the regime.
So Percier and Fontaine are an absolutely fabulous architectural duo. They will work together all their lives. They'd gone to Italy together to finish their studies. Napoleon will get to know them, and it will be a kind of intellectual and artistic thunderbolt.
It will fall to Percier and Fontaine to outline the future Rue de Rivoli. It will stretch from Place de la Concorde, in the extreme west of the capital, up to the Louvre for half a mile. In order to serve this new axis, several main streets will be opened, such as Rue de Castiglione and Rue des Pyramides, two Napoleonic victories in Italy and Egypt.
Napoleon still wants to put his stamp on the capital and to always give reminders of the army, of his campaigns, and of his own reign.
The opening of this huge street will cause the destruction of a number of buildings. Amongst them, an important place in the French Revolution, the Salle du Manège, seat of the revolutionary assemblies. It's within these walls on the 15th of January 1793 that King Louis XVI was condemned to death by the deputies of the nation.
We assume that Napoleon wasn't indifferent to the idea, firstly to start from scratch with these buildings, which are also representative of the ancient regime and the revolution, to really put his stamp on and mark the new regime of the consulate and later of the empire.
Napoleon would like to turn Rue de Rivoli into a main highway which would cross Paris from east to west. He takes over a project which dates back to the Revolution. According to this plan, Rue de Rivoli would follow the Louvre. It would then be extended by a large street which would join with Place de la Bastille to the east of the city. However, the obstacles are numerous.
It's not going to happen. On the one hand, for practical reasons, also for financial reasons, it needs something much more feasible, which is Rue de Rivoli.
Unlike the rest of the city, Percier and Fontaine know they'll meet fewer obstacles around the Tuileries. Many religious buildings have been emptied of their occupants during the French Revolution. Percier and Fontaine will replace this old neighborhood with innovative buildings with simple and harmonious lines. Facing the 65 feet wide street are buildings up to 98 feet tall, which must meet the same standard. 3 floors, topped with a roof of which the size could vary, but the slope had to be 45 degrees.
The interesting point about Rue de Rivoli is that it also forms an encasing for the Tuileries Palace. And the Tuileries Palace is a building, a castle which is very decorated, very ornate, and that's why he wants something very sober opposite, so that his residence stands out.
But if Rue de Rivoli will become an emblem, it's also thanks to its numerous arcades opening onto the pavement. There are porticos intended to offer a covered passage to the strollers and which embody the personal stamp of Napoleon Bonaparte on this major thoroughfare.
You can see there his Italian background because Corsicans from the cities, from the towns like Bassi Ajaccio, they were Italians by culture. His father was educated in Pisa and at Rome, and that comes over to him. And it's his own style. It's that blend of French classicism and traditional Italian urbanism that is Napoleon.
The result is a unique street in the history of Paris so far. Harmonious and orderly, it will be the facade of the new regime, efficient, modern, like the great antique models which fascinate Napoleon Bonaparte and all his generation.
That is the style of the educated, enlightened 18th century. They were about something new, and that newness was neoclassicism. If you look back to ancient Rome and to Greece. You do not look back to anything between yourselves and that.
Napoleon has not yet become emperor when the works on this monumental street start in 1804. Once the street is opened, Bonaparte orders the building of sewers, the symbol of hygiene and modernity. At the same time, the first gantries are raised by the government before private investors take over to finish the buildings. More than just a simple street, it's a wealthy and commercial neighborhood that Napoleon Bonaparte wants to raise, a project completed during the 1820s. Vast and airy, Haussmannian before its time, Rue de Rivoli is also a testimony to the will of Napoleon to improve the quality of life for Parisians. Parisians that the first consul loves as much as he fears. Napoleon knows what the people of Paris are capable of. He was witness during the Revolution, On the 10th of August, 1792, he attends the overthrowing of King Louis XVI and the massacre of the Swiss Guards by the Sans-Culottes in the Tuileries Palace.
He's present on that day and he sees the mob in action, and he's disgusted by it. He's a nobleman, and he looks naturally down on, in French they call it la canaille, the mob, and that moment marks him psychologically, this riot, terrible lawlessness.
Napoleon knows that a population that is hungry, a population that is scared, can be extremely dangerous. That he is fully aware of, and also that a revolution in France begins in Paris.
In order to be assured of the support of the Parisians, the first consul begins to improve the quality of their lives. Because following the revolution, Paris is a dirty city, foul-smelling, where hygiene is not yet a notion.
Paris is a city which is really lacking in drinking water. So people drink water from the Seine, which vaccinates you quite naturally if you survive it, but which is, let's say, extremely polluted.
At the same time, London is supplied with water which was of a much higher quality than Paris. So there was a political stake vis-à-vis the big capitals of the world, and Paris couldn't fall short.
To remedy this deleterious situation, in 1801 the first consul takes over a project several centuries old that nobody has ever succeeded in implementing. This primordial infrastructure, which the capital desperately needs, is the Canal de Lourdes, a network of 67 miles destined to provide Paris with drinking water.
Napoleon was deeply influenced by Roman history. They all were. Those are the only books they had, and they read them. And if, say, you look at Rome, what do the great emperors do? They build canals, viaducts, to bring fresh water in to the people of Rome. It's to help the sans-culottes. It's to bring them clean water.
This canal, wanted by Bonaparte, will divert the water from the river Ourcq, situated almost 62 miles northeast of Paris, before retrieving the water from several other streams, like that of the Beuvron and the Thérouanne. These waters will lead to the northeast of the city, to a gigantic basin at La Villette, from where the capital will be watered. The first consul will entrust the execution of this infrastructure, which is as important as it is political, to a man in which he has much confidence, the engineer Pierre-Simon Girard.
Napoleon chose Pierre-Simon Girard because he knows him, because he fought the campaign in Egypt, and he has confidence, generally absolute confidence, in people who've been around him. And he will name him head of this big project, and whom will also benefit from all the technical contribution from the Department of Civil Engineering. It's really going to be the big project of this company of engineers.
It's Pierre-Simon Girard who has the task of determining the course, the length, and who will manage the excavation. He will be reporting directly to the first consul, who is very interested in this project.
Napoleon will have a big dilemma. Will he build an aqueduct to transport the water solely for consumption, or will it be a canal? The canal has a double function, supplying Paris with drinking water, but also allowing for navigation.
Spurred on by the first consul, and against the wishes of numerous members of the commission leading the study, the project will change in nature. More than just an aqueduct intended for bringing drinking water to the people of Paris, the Ourcq will need to prevail as a central element in the development of the economy of the city, an infrastructure which must bring quality spring water, but also prosperity to the Parisians.
With this canal, Napoleon can think about commercial development for the city. He fully understood that Paris and France were behind, yet again, on the big
What you need to be aware of is that the English Industrial Revolution, as it starts in the last decades of the 18th century, is not a revolution in which the principal means of transport is the railways, but is in fact the canal. So they thought, what about using Canal de Lourdes to also bring provisions to Paris? So they're trying to kill two birds with one stone.
In the month of May 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte signs the decree which will formalize the excavation of the Canal de Lourdes. In order to give full meaning to the double function of this canal, the first consul will ratify the proposition of the engineers to add 2 additional waterways. South of the basin of La Villette, Canal Saint-Martin will cross the city and will be the junction with the Seine upstream from Paris. To the west, this role will be assigned to the Canal Saint-Denis, who in its turn will join the river, this time downstream of the capital. In this way, the boats will be able to cross Paris without having to follow the Seine.
At those times, crossing Paris is dangerous. There are no locks, so it's a river. There are periods of low water and high water, and by going through Canal Saint-Martin, the basin of La Villette and Canal Saint-Denis, you can avoid all the twists and turns of the Seine.
In order to establish a network designed to allow navigation while supplying Paris with drinking water, the engineer Pierre-Simon Girard has to respect one imperative: to prevent the water from stagnating and thus losing its qualities.
If you transport drinking water, you need the minimum amount of obstacles. That's why over 67 miles there are only 10 locks. That's the minimum number of obstacles which could have hindered the flow of water.
But Pierre-Simon Girard has another crucial problem to solve. With only 30 feet height difference, the equivalent of a 3-story building, between the highest point and the lowest point of the canal, its layout will have to be extremely precise.
It's always challenging to make a canal go up and down. If you go up, you need to find more water, etc. So in fact, the easiest way is to use the canals parallel to the rivers. It's the easiest because if you need it, there's a natural current.
Pierre-Simon Girard designs for his canal a course which follows the natural riverbeds, like the Ourcq or the Marne. The Canal de Lourdes will, therefore, be very long. It will total 67 miles between the intake of water at the River Ourcq and its arrival in Paris. Under the leadership of the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, and the engineer Pierre-Simon Girard, the excavation work and the earthwork start as early as 1802. The laborers begin their work not from upstream to downstream, but from downstream to upstream in order to evacuate the water from the rivers stopped by the digging of the canal.
The Beuvron and the Terouanne are going to flow into the Canal de Lourdes. So this water, when it arrives, must be evacuated. So it will be evacuated by the Canal Saint-Denis.
A canal is a big trench, slightly complicated because straight away you have locks which must be made with masonry. It's also complicated because you need to put clay in the bottom not to lose water, and at the time there wasn't concrete or material like that. So to make it watertight, rural techniques were still being used.
Started in 1802, when Bonaparte is first consul, the Canal de Lourdes project will continue until 1822. Unexpected events are numerous. In addition to hundreds of thousands of tons of earth to cart, the engineers face major landslides. There is much at stake which necessitates employing thousands of workers.
There are moments when a workforce will be demanded. As there had been great Napoleonic victories, there's a prisoner workforce, notably Prussians. So he will give 500 or 600 Prussian prisoners to complete the works. So it's a colossal job because thousands of people will clear the land in order to make the embankments and the digging and the backfill for the Canal de Lourdes.
In the background of this huge project, Pierre-Simon Girard and his team of engineers and workers are carrying out work of great precision. They need to keep the trench at a constant slope of an average of 3.5 inches per 0.6 miles over a length of 67 miles. An exploit they achieve with the aid of the master tool of topographical science, the level. With the help of a graduated leveling rod placed on point A, the engineer who is on point B can, in this way, evaluate the difference in height between the 2 points.
Normally, when there is a slope, point B should be lower than point A. So advancing in this way all along the canal, we can define precisely the leveling of the canal, which after the works will allow us to know, in relation to the natural ground we find ourselves on, what digging needs to be done to have a constant slope.
The Canal de l'Ourcq project benefits from the permanent attention of Napoleon. An artilleryman by training, Bonaparte is a man of science who understands the language of engineers, a man to whom no technical subtlety escapes.
Napoleon enormously enjoyed visiting building sites. So what he liked to do was to arrive early in the morning at 5 or 6 o'clock. And as was his habit, it was a rapid fire of questions, which needed very, very quick and brief answers, which he stored up.
It's a political building site. He has his reputation at stake. He has a promise which he has given to the Parisians, that they will finally have quality water. For Napoleon, it's imperative that this project is completed as quickly as possible.
The first water of the Canal de l'Ourcq arrives in the basin of La Villette in 1808. However, the network is still not finished. The Canal Saint-Martin, which must link the Canal de l'Ourcq with the Seine, is barely started, but its path is laid out. It will pass under the Place de la Bastille, where it will feed a giant fountain in the shape of an elephant, which will never be erected. It's there that in 1810, Napoleon will build a huge vault, one of the last projects of the emperor in the capital. The whole canal will be finished in 1825 and will establish itself as a major commercial and industrial infrastructure of Paris.
The basin of La Villette will even at one time be the principal port in France, and as a consequence, will aid the development of its warehouses and factories, which will develop progressively throughout the 19th century.
The Canal de l'Ourcq, the Rue de Rivoli, Vendôme Column, the Madeleine Church, the Arc de Triomphe. Every one of these projects, achieved or still in construction, will be left to the capital for posterity by Emperor Napoleon. He died in Sainte-Hélène in 1821, 6 years after his defeat at Waterloo. His ashes will eventually be repatriated by Louis-Philippe. They rest in the Dôme des Invalides, in the heart of this city that he dreamt of making imperial.